Hello class, this is section 4.2, amplitude, reflection, and period. So this first example, we're going to graph y equals 2 sine of x. So what you want to do with these, whenever you have sine or cosine, you always take the argument, which is x in this case. This is called the argument. And you always put it in between 0 and 2 pi, because that's one full period for the sine graph. So you would always put the argument between 0 and 2 pi, and then you solve for x. In this case, it's already solved, so you're ready to go. And then your amplitude is given by the absolute value of this number. So amplitude is equal to the absolute value of a, which in our case is absolute value of 2, which is 2. So now we can graph this function. We're going from 0 to 2 pi. This tells you where your graph starts. This tells you where your graph ends. And then you need to find 3 midpoints. 1 midpoint, 2 midpoint, 3 midpoint. So the first midpoint would just be the midpoint between 0 and 2 pi is pi. The midpoint between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And the midpoint between pi and 2 pi is 3/2 pi. Your amplitude is 2, so therefore you want to go up to 2 and down -2. So the sine of 0 is 0. If you look at your unit circle, you will see that. The sine of pi over 2 is 1, and then 1 times 2 is 2. And then sine of pi is 0. Sine of 3/2 pi is -1. -1 times 2 is -2. And then sine of 2 pi is 0. So there is your complete period, one cycle of sine y equals 2 sine x. Second example, the same sort of idea, except this is cosine, and the a is -2 in this case. So let's find the amplitude first. Absolute value of a, which in this case is the absolute value of -2, which is still +2. All right, and we are going to go from 0 to 2 pi again. Because once again, we set the argument in between 0 and 2 pi like we did before. And that tells you where your graph is going to start at 0 and where your graph is going to end at 2 pi. So starting point, end point, midpoint, midpoint, and midpoint. And now we can take, since the amplitude is 2, we want to go up 2 and down to -2. But at 0, cosine of 0 is 1. And then 1 times -2 is -2. So so at 0, it's going to be -2. The cosine of pi over 2 is 0. 0 times -2 is 0. The cosine of pi is -1. -1 times -2 is +2. And then cosine of 3/2 pi is 0, and cosine of 2 pi is 1. 1 times -2 is -2. So your graph will look like this. And since they want you to go all the way to 4 pi, we would just kind of extend the graph out and just keep on adding 1 pi over 2, another 1/2 pi, another 1/2 pi would be 3 pi, another 1/2 pi, and then another 1/2 pi would be 4 pi. And so your graph would just go back to 0, back to 2, back to 0, back to -2. And you can extend it in the opposite direction as well. So this would be -pi over 2, -pi, so on and so on. And it would go to 0 and 1, 2. And you would just continue in the other direction. All right, this time, for this one, notice there's a coefficient in front of x. That means your period is going to change. So once again, we start off by finding the amplitude, which is the absolute value of a, which is the absolute value of 1, which is 1. The period is given by the formula 2 pi over absolute value of b. So this is the general form of a sine or a cosine. That's your coefficient b. This is a. So it's going to be the absolute value of b, sorry. So this is going to be 2 pi over the absolute value of 2, which is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. All right. Then we set our argument is 2x. The argument goes between 0 and 2 pi. So I took the argument and I'm putting it in between 0 and 2 pi, and now I need to solve for x. And the way we do that is we can divide by 2 all the way through, and that'll give us our inequality that we need. So our graph is starting at 0 and going to pi. So let's draw that graph. So here's 0, here's pi. And then we need to find 3 midpoints. The first midpoint would be pi over 2. This midpoint would be pi over 4. And then this midpoint between these two values, this is a half and this is 1, so that would be 3/4. So the way you find midpoints, if you have trouble with that, it's going to be the x1 plus x2 divided by 2. So x1, for example, would be pi over 2, x2 would be pi. You would add those two values and then you divide by 2, and that's how you get 3/4 pi. All right, and so now we know that the amplitude is 1, so we're going up to 1 and down to -1. Cosine of 0, sine of 0 is 0, so we start at 0. And then you plug in pi over 4. If you were to plug in pi over 4 here, that's going to give you pi over 2, which is 1. But you don't even need to go through those. You don't really have to plug in these values, since you already know that sine starts at 0 and it goes up 1, 0, down 1, back to 0. So that's why we find 3 midpoints, so that we have a total of 5 angles. So you got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 angles. And now since sine starts at 0, then you go up to 1, 0, -1, back to 0. That's your 1 complete period of sine. All right, the last example is cosine. So let's start with the amplitude again. Amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is the absolute value of 4, which is 4. The period is 2 pi over absolute value of B, which is 2 pi over absolute value of -2/3, which is going to be 3 pi. Because you're going to multiply by the reciprocal, and you should get 3 pi there. All right, and now we put our argument. This is your argument between 0 and 2 pi. And then you can solve for x by multiplying by the reciprocal, -3/2, -3/2 all the way across. So you're going to end up with 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to negative, negative 3 pi. Yeah, -3 pi. All right. But we multiplied by a negative, so that really reverses this. It switches the signs. So this is going to be the same thing as -3 pi less than or equal to x less than or equal to 0. So we're reversing it because we're multiplying through by a negative, which changes the direction of the inequalities. So now this is what our graph is going to look like. So we go, let's sketch this curve. This time 0 is here. We got -1/2 pi, negative pi, -3/2 pi, -2 pi, and so on and so on. So we can just extend it out as far as we need to go. I'm just going to stop at that point here. And over here, let's do the same thing and do the same thing in the opposite direction. So there's your pi over 2, pi, 3/2 pi, 2 pi. All right, so let's start with 0. And the amplitude is 4, so we're going to go up to 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, -4. So at 0, cosine of 0 is 1. 1 times 4 is 4. And then we know we're going to go back to 0, -1, 0, +1. Same thing in the opposite direction, 0, -1, 0. +1 times 4 is 4. All right. And you could keep on going if you wanted to keep going in both directions. That does it for that. Let's focus on the homework. So here's the homework. All right, we'll skip these first ones. So this one, it says find the amplitude. Well, the amplitude is given by the absolute value of 3, which is 3, as you can see. All right, this one, the amplitude is going to be absolute value of A, which is 8. And cosine starts at the amplitude. It does not start at 0. So this would be out of the question, So it's going to start at the amplitude or negative amplitude, depending on what the sign is. This is a -8, which means it's going to be down here. So that is the correct choice. And there's our amplitude. The period, they want us to find the period, is defined as 2 pi over absolute value of b, which is 2 pi over the absolute value of 1/10, which is 2 pi times 10, which is 20 pi. All right, we got to graph one complete cycle. So what we do is we take the argument and we put it in between 0 and 2 pi and solve for x. We can divide by 2. All right, so our graph is going to start at 0 and at pi. So this one's out of the question because it ends at 4 pi. This one possibly could be it. This one could possibly be it. And this one can possibly be it. So let's see which one. The amplitude is 1 because the absolute value of A is 1. So it can't be this one. That amplitude is 1/2. So it's got to be between these two choices. And the difference is that the cycle should finish at pi. This one is going beyond pi. So it's got to be this one. It's got to finish at pi. And the period we said is pi. 2 pi over b. Well, 2 pi over b is pi. So that's your period. All right, same thing with this one. The period is going to be, the amplitude is absolute value of 1, which is 1. The period is 2 pi over absolute value of b, which is going to be 6 pi. So this is going to go all the way to 6 pi. So this one is definitely not it. Definitely not it. And it's got to be between these two choices because this is going to 6 pi. This one is also going to 6 pi. It just got cut off. But it's got to be between these two choices. And because the amplitude is 1, cosine starts at the top because the coefficient is +1. If it would have been -1, it would have started down below. But since the coefficient here is +1, that means you start up at +1. And there's our period, 6 pi. All right, let's figure out what the amplitude for this one is also 1. The period would be 2 pi over absolute value of b, which is going to be 4 in this case. So we're going from 0 to 4. So these two cannot be it because those are going only to 2. We need to go all the way to 4. So it's got to be between these two down here. And if you notice, the coefficient is +1, not -1. So it's going to go up first and then down. So it's got to be this one because it goes up first and then it goes down because of the coefficient being +1. And we already know that the period is 4. All right. This one has an amplitude of, as you can see, it reaches 2 and -2, so the amplitude is 2. The period will be, it looks like it starts at 0 and ends at 2. This is one complete cycle, so that means a period is 2. This has an amplitude of 5, and the period goes from negative pi over 4 to 3/4 pi. So the way you find the period is you subtract. You would do 3/4 pi minus negative pi over 4. That's how you find the period. In this case, when you're given two graphs, these two become plus, so you get 4 over 4, which is pi. Okay, graph 1 complete cycle. Well, we know that the amplitude is going to be 2. That one's out. Out. It's got to be between these two choices here. Let's find the period. The period is going to be 2 pi over absolute value of 1/4, which is 8 pi. And it has to be the top, because that's the only one that goes to 8 pi. All right. The amplitude for this one is going to be absolute value of negative 1/4, which is 1/4. So this one is clearly out. It's too high. This one's out. It's got to be between these two. And let's find the period to determine which of those two it will be. 2 pi over b, which is going to be 8. So it's got to go all the way to 8. And as you can see, this one does not go to 8, but this one does go to 8. So it has to be this choice. All right. So this one has an amplitude of 4, so that's good. 4, 4, 4, 4. So we can eliminate any of the choices based on the amplitude. So now we have to find the period. The period would be 2 pi over absolute value of pi, which is 2. So let's see here. This one looks like it would go from here to here. So that's a possibility. This one is not. This would go from here to here. That's too much. That's 4. That's a period of 4. So that one's out. This one would go from here to here. That's period 2. This one clearly does not have a period of 2, so that one's out. So it's got to be between these two choices here and here. So we know that cosine starts at the amplitude, and it's positive, so it should start at positive 4, like that. So this is the one. It starts at positive 4. There you go. So it's got to be